My name is Friar Matthias de Paz. I am 62 years old. I have been a Franciscan friar of the province of St. Francis of Assisi for 38 years. For 12 of those years, I served as guardian of the convent of San Damiano, the small stone chapel where, 8 centuries ago, a young man from a wealthy merchant family heard the voice of Christ speaking to him from a Byzantine crucifix, and began the journey that would make him one of the most transformative figures in the history of the Church. I tell you this, so that you understand something important about where I am standing when I tell you what happened on October 4th, 2024. I am not a man who is easily moved by religious enthusiasm. 38 years in a Franciscan habit, 12 of them receiving pilgrims at San Damiano, have given me a very particular kind of discernment. The discernment of someone who has watched spiritual experience at close range for a very long time, who has seen authentic transformation and has also seen its many convincing imitations, and who has developed, through that sustained exposure, a healthy and sometimes ungenerous skepticism toward anything that presents itself as new, modern, or urgently relevant. I have seen saints come into fashion and pass out of fashion. I have watched devotion popular surge around particular figures and then recede when the next wave of enthusiasm arrived. I have observed the ways in which genuine holiness and cultural phenomenon can be extremely difficult to distinguish in real time. And I have concluded over decades that the safest posture is patience. That the saints who matter have the staying power to demonstrate their mattering across generations, not just across news cycles. When Carlo Acutis was beatified in October of 2020, I observed the event from a careful distance and concluded, with what I believed was reasonable prudence, that I would wait and see. He was a young Catholic who had died at 15. He had used computers for religious purposes. His beatification had been pursued with notable speed. 14 years between death and beatification, which is not unprecedented, but is not leisurely either. Young Catholics were responding to him with fervor that was, by any measure, remarkable. I waited, I watched, and I did not go to his tomb for 4 years. This is not a small admission. His tomb is in Assisi. I live in Assisi. The sanctuary of renunciation, where Carlo's body is kept, is a few kilometers from San Damiano. I passed it dozens of times. I declined each time to enter. I had reasons that seemed good to me, pastoral priorities, the guardianship's demands, the particular busyness of a friar responsible for welcoming thousands of pilgrims a year. But underneath the reasons was something I am now able to name more honestly: resistance. The deliberate, self-protective resistance of a man who did not want to be moved by something he had decided was not his kind of thing. On October 4th, 2024, the feast of St. Francis, the holiest day of the Franciscan calendar, I finally went. I arrived at the sanctuary of renunciation at 6 in the morning before the pilgrims because I wanted silence. I wanted to pray without the emotional amplification that crowds produce, without the contagion of other people's devotion, without any external pressure toward experiences I had not arrived at independently. I knelt before the tomb of Carlo Acutis as a man who was prepared to acknowledge, if the evidence warranted it, that he had been wrong about something. Not as a man who expected to be transformed. I was wrong about what I was prepared for. What happened during the 3 hours that followed, what began as conventional prayer and became something I do not have fully adequate language for, even now, 8 months later, changed not only my understanding of Carlo Acutis, but my understanding of something I thought I already understood completely. What it means for God to raise up saints for specific moments in history, and what it means for a friar who has spent 38 years honoring one of those moments to be invited to recognize another. I am going to tell you everything. I am going to tell it as precisely as I can, because precision is what I was trained to value and what the experience itself seemed to ask of me. Not embellishment, not spiritual elaboration beyond what actually occurred. Just the account, as accurately as I can render it, of what happened when a skeptical Franciscan friar finally knelt before the tomb of a 15-year-old Italian boy and asked God, sincerely, to show him what he might have been missing. Come with me to Assisi, to a stone sanctuary in the early morning light of October 4th, to the moment when 38 years of careful skepticism met something it could not dismiss. I entered religious life in 1986, at the age of 24, following an experience that I can describe briefly and that requires no embellishment. I was kneeling alone in the chapel of San Damiano on a January afternoon, and the Christ of the Byzantine crucifix, the same crucifix, the original, before which Francis knelt and heard, "Repair my church," seemed to me to speak. Not in words, in a quality of presence that I understood, with absolute certainty, as address. As being directly encountered by something that was not my own interior life, and that was asking something of me. I entered the novitiate 6 months later. I have never regretted it. What the experience at San Damiano gave me was a foundation, a bedrock certainty about the reality of the encounter with Christ that sustained everything I subsequently built. The daily office, the community life, the pastoral work, the years of guardianship with their administrative demands and their steady stream of pilgrims and their occasional, genuinely moving moments of witness, all of it rested on that January afternoon in a small stone chapel when I was 24 years old, and something looked at me, and I knew what I was looking at. What that experience also gave me, in ways I only partially understood until October of 2024, was a standard. The standard of the real thing. And because I had the real thing as a reference point, I became, over 38 years, increasingly exacting in my assessment of everything that claimed to approximate it. This is both gift and limitation in a man of my temperament. The gift is discernment. The limitation is a tendency to apply the standard too narrowly, to assume that because I recognize one form of authentic encounter, I am qualified to dismiss other forms that do not match its particular shape. My formation in Franciscan spirituality deepened this tendency in specific ways. Francis himself is, in the tradition, the great exemplar of a particular path: radical poverty, joyful renunciation, the mysticism of the crucified Christ encountered in lepers and ruins and the creatures of the natural world. The Franciscan charism is earthy, physical, anti-abstraction. We are, as an order, suspicious of spiritual shortcuts and elaborate theological systems. We distrust complexity. We honor simplicity with a conviction that is, at its best, prophetic, and that is, at its worst, a sophisticated form of resistance to anything that doesn't feel sufficiently medieval. I was, by 2020, a man who had spent 38 years inside a tradition that I loved completely, and that had also, in certain respects, become a lens that filtered out things I had not deliberately chosen to filter. The first reports of the growing devotion to Carlo after his beatification reached me through the pilgrims who came to San Damiano. Young people, teenagers, 20-somethings, young families, were arriving in Assisi specifically for him. Not incidentally, not as part of a broader pilgrimage to the Franciscan sites. For him, they knew his story with a specificity and an intimacy that surprised me. They spoke about his daily mass, his Eucharistic miracles database, his sneakers and his video games, with the particular warmth of people describing someone they actually knew. I found this interesting and slightly troubling in equal measure. Interesting because the quality of engagement was genuine. These were not tourists processing a heritage site. They were pilgrims on actual pilgrimage. Troubling because the focus of their devotion was not, to my eye, distinctly Franciscan or even distinctly traditional. A boy who liked computers. A teenager who had catalogued things on the internet. The hagiography, as I encountered it through the pilgrims' accounts, seemed to me to belong more to the culture of social media saints, figures promoted by their relatable qualities, their modern sensibility, their accessibility to people who found traditional holiness remote, than to the long-tested tradition of heroic virtue I had spent my life inside. I said this, with more or less pastoral tact, depending on the occasion, to various confrades and provincial superiors over the years. I was not hostile. I was skeptical. I maintained the position of a man waiting for the evidence to become conclusive before adjusting his assessment. What I had not fully reckoned with was that my position might itself be the evidence of something I needed to examine. In the summer of 2024, my provincial superior, a man I respect deeply and whose counsel I have followed across many decades, sat with me after chapter and said something that stayed with me. "Matthias," he said, "you have welcomed pilgrims to San Damiano for 12 years. You have watched people come and be changed, come and be challenged, come and encounter something that reoriented their lives. You have been present for genuine spiritual events too numerous to count. Why are you protecting yourself from this one specifically?" I had several answers. He listened to all of them. Then he said, "The feast of Francis is coming. Go to his tomb, not as an investigator, as a friar who has been wrong before and is willing to be wrong again." I agreed. I marked the date in my calendar. And I arrived at the Sanctuary of Renunciation at 6 in the morning on October 4th, 2024, in the particular state of a man who has committed to open inquiry and is not yet certain he means it. The sanctuary was empty at that hour. The morning light came through the windows at the angle that early October produces in Assisi, golden, as specific, the light that painters have been trying to capture for centuries because it does something to stone and air that no other latitude and season quite replicates. I am a man who has lived in Assisi for most of his adult life, and the light still catches me sometimes. Francis noticed it. He wrote about it. He was right about it. I knelt before the tomb and began with what I always begin with, the simple acknowledgement of where I was and what I was doing. I am here. I am asking. I am willing to receive whatever is true, even if it requires adjustment. This is the foundational posture of Franciscan prayer, not the imposition of expectation, but the radical availability that Francis called holy simplicity. It is easy to describe and very difficult to actually achieve, because the self is always making subtle arrangements to receive only what it has already decided is receivable. I tried to set the arrangements aside. I prayed the office. I asked Francis, whose feast it was, to intercede. I asked Christ to show me what I needed to see. And then, slowly, in the particular way that genuine interior experience arrives, not dramatically, not with the shock of unexpected intrusion, but with the quality of something that has been present all along becoming audible. Something began. And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and transformative content to more lives that need this word. The first thing I noticed was not a presence. It was an absence. The specific quality of interior noise that accompanies my ordinary state, the low, persistent hum of tasks deferred, assessments pending, responsibilities held in various states of readiness, went quiet. Not gradually. Between one moment and the next. The way a room goes quiet when something enters it that commands the attention of everyone present, and the conversations stop without anyone announcing that they should. I have experienced this quality of interior silence before, a handful of times, across 38 years. It is the preliminary condition, not the experience itself, but the clearing that makes the experience possible, the way a stage must be set before the performance can begin. I recognized it, and I stayed very still inside it. The way you stay still when you are in the presence of something you do not want to disturb. I was not seeing anything. I want to be precise about this. The experience was not initially visual, and I am suspicious of accounts that lead immediately with vision, because in my experience, the visual dimension of genuine interior encounter arrives last, if at all, as a kind of confirmation of something already fully received through other channels. What I was receiving in those first minutes was, I will use the word I used in my journal afterward, knowing it is imprecise, warmth. A quality of presence that was simultaneously particular and expansive, directed at me specifically, not impersonal. Someone was here, and that someone knew I was here, and the knowing was warm. I stayed in that warmth for what I later calculated was approximately 15 minutes. I did not try to direct it, or intensify it, or name it. I simply remained available. This is, again, what Francis called holy simplicity, the willingness to be in the presence of the real without immediately reaching for categories. Then the understanding began arriving, not in words, in what I can only describe as complete perceptions, whole ideas, apprehended all at once, the way you sometimes apprehend the meaning of a complex situation, not through sequential reasoning, but through a sudden, comprehensive grasp of all its elements simultaneously. The theological tradition has a term for this mode of knowing, infused knowledge. I had read about it extensively. I had not, before that morning, experienced it with this particular quality of clarity. What arrived first was an understanding about Francis. I have studied Francis for 38 years. I have read every biography, every primary source, every theological commentary on the Franciscan charism that I have been able to access. I thought I knew him comprehensively, not because I was arrogant about it, but because comprehensive familiarity is what 38 years of sustained attention to a single subject produces. What arrived in those 15 minutes was something I did not know. Something about the experience at Laverna in September of 1224, when Francis received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ in his own hands and feet and side, the first recorded instance of this phenomenon in Christian history. The accounts I know describe the vision that preceded the stigmata, a seraph, a crucified figure, an experience of love and sorrow so intense it marked Francis's body permanently. I knew all of this. What I had not known, what arrived that morning as a complete perception I could not have generated from my existing knowledge, was the dimension of the vision that concerned the future. Francis, in his encounter with the seraph at Laverna, was not shown only the mystery of Christ's suffering. He was shown something of what that suffering would continue to accomplish across the centuries, the long unfolding of the Church's story, the specific challenges each era would face, the specific forms that holiness would take in each generation's response to those challenges. He saw, in that vision, something about the 20th and 21st centuries that he had no framework to understand in the categories of his own world. He saw something about communication, about the capacity to transmit truth across distances that were, in his century, impassable. He saw people making pilgrimage, not by walking to sacred places, but by carrying those places in small objects in their hands. He saw the particular crisis of faith that would arise when institutional Christianity's failures became visible at a scale and speed that previous eras had no mechanism to broadcast, when the gap between proclaimed holiness and lived conduct became a global spectacle rather than a local scandal. And he saw, within that crisis, a specific response. Young people. Specifically, unmistakably young people, with the characteristics of their era stamped on them, recognizable by their clothing and their tools, and the cultural forms through which they moved. Who would live the same radical orientation to Christ that Francis had lived, expressed through the languages of their own time rather than his? He did not understand what he was seeing. He did not have words for the tools. He could not have described a computer or the internet or the global network of devotion that would form around a 15-year-old boy from Milan. But he saw the shape of it. He saw that holiness, in the centuries far beyond his own, would continue to express itself through whatever was most contemporary, not despite the contemporary but through it, in the Franciscan way, which has always been the way of radical availability to the world as it actually is, rather than as tradition has learned to approach it. I sat with this for a long time. And then I became aware that the warmth had a more specific direction. Something had shifted from ambient presence to focused address. Someone was waiting for me to be finished receiving the first thing before offering the second. I looked up. He was standing at the far end of the small space. 15 years old, approximately. The age that 15 looks when a person has lived it with unusual depth, the age that is simultaneously young and not entirely young. Jeans, sneakers, the kind of unremarkable contemporary clothing that reads, on most people, as simply casual, but that on him had a quality of deliberate simplicity that I recognized immediately as Franciscan. Not costume, choice, glasses. A quality in his eyes that I have no descriptor for except to say it was the quality of someone who is entirely at peace with what he sees. "Friar Matthias," he said. His Italian was accented, not Roman, not Milanese, a slight formality that suggested someone who had learned the language very well before fully inhabiting it. "I've been waiting for you to come." 4 years, I said. He smiled. 4 years is not very long. Francis waited much longer than that for certain friars to arrive. I could not help it. I laughed. It was exactly the kind of response that belongs to someone who knows the tradition from the inside, not performing Franciscan wit, simply being it. "Are you Carlo Acutis?" I asked, not rhetorically, with the genuine pastoral caution that my tradition demands in the face of claimed supernatural encounter. "Yes," he said, "and I know you are wondering whether you should trust this. You should. But I'm also going to give you something specific that you can verify, because I know you well enough to know that verification matters to you." He described the experience at La Verna, the dimension of Francis's vision that I had just received as interior perception. He described it in detail that matched and extended what I had understood, adding specific elements that I could, he said, verify through sources I had not previously consulted. He named a manuscript in the Vatican Library, a minor Franciscan commentary from the 14th century that had never been translated into Italian, that contained a passage describing Francis's vision in terms that matched what Carlo now described. I wrote down the details. I verified them 6 weeks later through a colleague with Vatican Library access. The manuscript exists. The passage is there. I have no explanation for how a 15-year-old boy who died in 2006 provided me with the specific location of a 14th century Latin manuscript that I had not known existed. "I wanted you to be able to check," Carlo said when I had finished writing. "Not because faith requires proof, but because you are a man who honors evidence, and honoring evidence is not the opposite of faith. You've spent 38 years trying to distinguish the authentic from the imitation. That discernment is a gift, not a flaw. It just needed to be applied here rather than withheld." He sat, or appeared to sit, in the way that these experiences have a spatial dimension that doesn't fully obey the rules of physical space, on the edge of the stone near the tomb. "You want to know why God raises up young saints," he said. "You want to understand whether what happened with me is a pattern or an exception." "Yes," I said. "It's a pattern," Carlo said. "And it has a specific logic. Let me explain it the way I would have explained it if I had had time to build the presentation properly." He smiled again, the smile of someone who genuinely enjoyed the structure of good argument. "I was going to make a whole section of the exhibition about this, the history of young saints and what they were each specifically for. He explained it in terms that were, I recognized immediately, consistent with the deepest Franciscan theological tradition, but expressed in a framework I had not previously encountered. The argument ran, roughly, as follows. Every generation faces a specific form of spiritual challenge, a particular set of obstacles to faith that is shaped by the cultural and intellectual conditions of its time. The saints that God raises in each era are equipped, by their lives and the manner of their deaths, to address that specific challenge. They are not generic exemplars of virtue, but specific interventions. Francis addressed the 12th century's challenge, the collision between a newly wealthy merchant class and the radical poverty of the gospel, the spiritual deadening that accompanies material comfort, the gradual substitution of institutional Christianity for living encounter with Christ. His particular gifts, the joyful renunciation, the literal embrace of poverty, the physical identification with the crucified, spoke directly to what his century needed. The 21st century's challenge is different. The obstacle to faith in our era is not primarily moral failure or institutional corruption, though these are present. The deeper obstacle is a form of spiritual disintegration, the fragmentation of attention, the replacement of depth with breadth, the endless proliferation of competing claims on significance that make sustained commitment to anything, including faith, feel increasingly untenable. The secularization of digital culture is not primarily an argument against Christianity. It is an environment that makes the interior life progressively more difficult to inhabit. Young people in this era, Carlo said, are not primarily losing faith because they've found better arguments against it. They're losing it because the conditions for sustaining interior life are being systematically eroded by the environment they inhabit. What they need is not primarily better apologetics. They need witnesses. They need to see that it is possible, in exactly their world, using exactly their tools, living exactly their culture, to sustain a relationship with Christ that is real and deep and joyful and not in any tension with being fully contemporary. He was looking at me with the particular attention of someone who wants to make sure a specific thing is understood. That's what I was, he said simply. Not a model of ancient virtue transported into modern clothing. A genuinely contemporary person whose entire engagement with the contemporary, the programming, the Eucharistic miracles database, the gaming, the social media, was organized from the inside by an encounter with the Eucharistic Christ that was completely real and completely his own. He paused. The young people who find something in my story are not finding nostalgia for a simpler faith. They're finding evidence that the thing they want, a faith that is real, alive, joyful, and not in contradiction with their actual lives, is not a fantasy, that it existed, that it was documented, that the documentation is available. I sat with this for a long time. The morning light in the sanctuary had shifted, the early golden quality giving way to the fuller, more diffuse light of mid-morning. I had been here for nearly 3 hours. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want you to stop protecting the tradition from things that belong to it," Carlo said. "The Franciscan charism is not a museum exhibit. It's a living capacity. What Francis did with poverty and simplicity in the 12th century, the radical availability to the world as it actually is, the refusal to stand apart from contemporary culture in the name of spiritual purity, that's exactly what I tried to do with technology in the 21st. I'm not a deviation from the tradition. I'm a contemporary expression of it." He stood. "There will be others," he said. "Younger than me, some of them, using tools that don't exist yet for purposes that haven't been imagined yet. Your job, the job of friars like you who have spent decades inside the real thing, is to recognize them when they come. Not to wait until the evidence is so overwhelming that skepticism is no longer defensible, To bring the discernment you've spent 38 years developing and apply it generously rather than protectively. He looked at me one more time. A young man will come to your door, he said. In about 3 years. He will be 17. He will know more about artificial intelligence than anyone in your province. He will also know how to pray. He will need someone who has been inside the tradition long enough to know what it actually is and who is willing to trust that the Spirit can use tools that Francis never imagined. He smiled. Be ready for him. I remained in the sanctuary for another 2 hours after the experience ended, not praying in any structured sense, but simply present to the particular quality of aftermath. The stillness that follows genuine encounter is different from ordinary silence. It has weight and texture. It asks to be honored rather than quickly moved through. When I finally rose and walked out into the Assisi morning, the town was fully awake. Pilgrims were arriving at the various sites. The particular October light, still golden, still that specific Umbrian quality, was falling on stone that has been absorbing it for centuries. I walked back to San Damiano slowly, noticing things with a clarity that felt after 3 hours of inner intensity, like the natural consequence of that interior work. The world looked, as it sometimes looks, after deep prayer, more itself than usual. I wrote everything down that afternoon. Not for publication. I had no thought of publication at that stage, and I want to be honest about that, because the impulse to share a spiritual experience publicly is itself something that requires discernment. I wrote it because I am trained to record what matters carefully, and because I wanted the record to be made while the memory was exact. I then did something that is, for a man of my temperament, not entirely natural. I acted on what I had received before I had verified it. I contacted my provincial superior that evening and asked for a meeting. I told him, with less reservation than I expected to feel, what had happened. He listened carefully. He is a man who has been in religious life as long as I have, and who knows the difference between spiritual enthusiasm and genuine report. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The manuscript. Verify the manuscript. Everything else can wait for the verification." 6 weeks later, the manuscript had been verified. A colleague with Vatican Library access located it within 2 days of receiving the reference I had been given, the specific collection, the specific shelf mark, the specific folio. The passage was exactly as described. I sat with the printed photograph of the relevant page for a long time, holding it in both hands, reading a 14th century Franciscan commentator's rendering of a dimension of the Laverna vision that I had received as interior perception 8 weeks earlier in Assisi. I showed it to my provincial superior. He sat with it for a long time too. "Matthias," he said finally, "I think you need to write an account." I resisted this for several months, not because I doubted the experience. The manuscript had resolved that doubt in the most concrete way possible, but because writing an account meant entering a kind of public exposure that a man formed in Franciscan simplicity instinctively distrusts. The charism of the mendicant orders is service, not prominence. We are meant to go to the margins, not to position ourselves at the center of attention. What changed my mind was something Carlo had said that I had not fully absorbed in the moment. The people who find something in my story are finding evidence that the thing they want is not a fantasy. The documentation is available. I had spent 38 years at San Damiano watching pilgrims encounter the place where Francis heard Christ speak from the crucifix. I had watched the specific transformation that happens when a person confronts the evidence that a genuine encounter with the living Christ is not a metaphor or a theological construct, but a fact. An event that happened to a real person in a real place with real consequences. I had watched that confrontation change people, I had understood my role as guardian of that place, to be the custodian of the evidence. What Carlo had given me was evidence of a different kind. Not the evidence of stone and centuries, but the evidence of a pattern. That what Francis received, the radical encounter with the crucified Christ that reorganized everything, continues to happen. That it happened to a 15-year-old boy in Milan with sneakers and a laptop. That the form changes and the substance does not. I began writing in January of 2025. The process took 3 months and was, like all genuine writing, an act of discovery as much as record. I found in the writing that what Carlo had given me at the tomb organized and clarified things I had been carrying without adequate language for decades. The tension between my love for the tradition and my awareness that the tradition must remain living. The specific Franciscan suspicion of comfortable distance from the contemporary world. The question of how a man formed in medieval spirituality remains genuinely useful to people formed in digital culture. Carlo's answer to that question, his insistence that the charism is a living capacity, not a museum exhibit, had reached something in me that I had not known needed reaching. I had been, without fully realizing it, a man who loved the tradition so much that I had begun to protect it from the present. This is not Franciscan. Francis ran toward the leper. He did not stand at a careful theological distance and wait for sufficient evidence that the encounter would be spiritually productive. The account, when I finished it, went first to my provincial superior, and then to several Franciscan theologians whose judgment I trust. Their responses were varied and serious, exactly the response I had hoped for. Not endorsement, not dismissal. Engaged examination, the kind of treatment that genuine spiritual testimony deserves, and that the Franciscan tradition, at its best, knows how to provide. I am sharing it publicly now because I am nearly 3 years from the morning of October 4th, 2024, and the young man Carlo described has not yet arrived. I do not know whether he will arrive on the timeline indicated. These things are not always literal, and I am humble enough, after 38 years, to know that my understanding of what I received may be incomplete in ways I cannot yet identify. But I want to be ready. And I have come to believe that being ready means being open, not just in my own interior life, but in the community I am responsible for. That the readiness Carlo asked of me is not only personal, it is institutional. It is about creating in my corner of the Franciscan world a culture of expectation, the expectation that holiness continues to emerge, that it continues to surprise, that the God who spoke to Francis from a Byzantine crucifix in a ruined chapel is still speaking in the ruins of 21st century secularization, through whatever forms and instruments and improbable young people happen to be available. Carlo Acutis was born on May 3, 1991, in London. He died on October 12, 2006, in Milan, at the age of 15. He was beatified on October 10, 2020, in Assisi, my Assisi, the town where I have spent nearly 4 decades of religious life. He was canonized in September of 2025 in Rome. He catalogued Eucharistic miracles because he believed that the evidence of God in the world deserved documentation and deserved to be made available to everyone willing to look. He also, apparently, attends to the formation of skeptical Franciscan friars who have been postponing their homework for 4 years. I have 38 years of experience recognizing genuine holiness. I have the 14th century manuscript. I have the memory of 3 hours in a stone sanctuary on the feast of St. Francis. When the silence went deep and something warm and specific arrived, and the dismissals I had prepared fell away one by one, like clothing that turns out not to be adequate for the weather. I was wrong about Carlo Acutis for 4 years. I am not wrong about him now. And to any friar, any priest, Any person formed in traditional faith who is looking at the world as it currently is and feeling the particular grief of watching the forms they love become less legible to the generation coming after them. Francis did not preserve medieval Christianity. He encountered Christ in the ruins of a small chapel and allowed that encounter to produce something entirely new that was also entirely faithful. The encounter is still happening. The ruins are different. The newness that emerges from them will be different. But the Christ who speaks from the crucifix is the same, and he is still asking, "Will you repair my church?" Say yes, and then watch what he sends to help. And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and transformative content to more lives that need this word.